Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Stephen Peinecker, and I am so excited to have back on the program Apostle Adam Stokes of the Church of Christ with Elijah Message, The Assured Way of the Lord. Welcome to the program, sir.
Great to be back, Steve. Thanks for having me.
So,
Long time no see.
yeah, I know. And I know we've been getting a lot of great feedback from people. They really enjoyed our conversation. And I wanted to ask you a question that a few people have asked me, because they go on and said, now here's this guy, he was a progressive Baptist, he has a spiritual experience reading the Book of Mormon, he goes to the Church of Jesus Christ, the Bickertonite organization, he goes to the Community of Christ. Why didn't he ever go to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and look at them as being a possible landing spot?
That is a wonderful question. Yeah, I get that question actually all the time. In fact, when I go out to Utah for conferences, people ask me that question. The main reason for that, I have very good relations with the Utah LDS Church. Many of my close friends, many of my close colleagues are members of that church, as I think I mentioned last time. At the time when I first started getting interested in the restoration, um, my wife in particular, she wasn't quite certain about the Mormons. So there's a lot of stuff that goes around in basically Catholic and Protestant circles that the Mormons are a cult and everything. So she was kind of reluctant to have me join the LDS Church, but that was something that I did express interest in. The main thing, so that was about 30% of it. The other 70% really, Steve, was convenience. There wasn't an LDS meeting house where we were in Ben Salem, at least nearby. So the Bickertonites, even that was kind of far away, as I mentioned the last time. And the Community of Christ Church was right down the street, and it was really convenient for us economically at the time. So 70% was economics, 30% was kind of my wife's reluctancy for me to affiliate with the LDS Church. And I think that's changed over the years. She's very supportive, but at the time, she heard the word Mormon in Catholic and Protestant circles, especially within the African American community. You think these cult people who don't like Black people, so
Okay.
which is completely untrue, but that's I think that was the sentiment at the time. This was back in 2012
Sure.
or
Well, that
so.
makes sense. And I can also see how the Community of Christ and even the Church of Jesus Christ would be a little bit easier for her to
Yeah,
get
so I used
around,
to,
right?
it's funny you mention that because I used to take her to services when I was with the Bickertonites and even with the Community of Christ. And a Bickertonite service, and we talked about this, I know last time, is very similar to just a Christian Protestant service, but they believe also in the Book of Mormon.
Yep. And I think that's the key thing. And I brought many Christians to Vicarage Night services because they feel very comfortable in those services as
Yeah.
well. And so that answers the big question I kept on getting asked about Adam. And I thought, okay, that we got that out of the way. So
I do have several dear friends who say that one day I will join the LDS Church. So we will see about that.
never know.
Um,
You just never know. Maybe you'll be one of those few people who were apostles in two separate branches of the restoration.
I'm very content where I am now. I
I
feel
know
like
you are.
with the Assured Way. I believe in it fully. So, but my friends always joke and say, I'll when you want to join the Utah LES, I'll be the one who baptizes you.
That's great. I love to hear that. So the reason I had Adam on was actually originally we were going to talk about this in the first episode, but the first episode was so fascinating, just hearing about the history of your church. And folks, if you haven't seen it yet, go and watch that because you want to know about the temple lot, the history of the temple lot, and the auto fetting. And it's just a fascinating story. That's an undertold story of the restoration, and it's worthy of this great story to be told. I'm glad we were able to give it a platform because a lot of people haven't heard this story. The main reason was I wanted to talk about this book, From Egypt to Ohio, A Semitic Origin for the Giants of North America. And I just finished reading the book today. And I have to say, so we're going to talk about giants, and we're also going to try to talk an Egypt to Ohio connection, Hebrew, Egyptian roots and connections. And then we might even touch on the Book of Abraham today, too, because that's another favorite subject of yours. But first, we're going to jump into this thing called the Giants of North America. Now, this is the thing, folks. Now, if anybody reads any histories of the mound builders and stuff like that, they were associated with giants. And there were many people that had claimed to find giants buried in these mounds. And it was almost pretty widely accepted by a lot of people that giants played a role in building some of these structures in North America. As a matter of fact, you even quote Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln also believed that too. So this was a pretty mainstream idea. This wasn't a fringy thing, because they were finding these, and you had pointed out to me that as late as 1980, actually it was in the book, in as late as 1980 in National Geographic magazine, they actually described finding people that were 7 to 9 feet tall skeletons in the mounds. So they seem to think that there was validity to it. And also, you quoted from Scientific America from the 19th century that also describes these giants as well. I didn't know that. So I thought this was kind of like a carny thing where they make these things and make them up, and then they would go on these road shows with these giants, and that we uncovered. And I just kind of thought they were all hoaxes. But actually, there's something to them finding giants, apparently.
Yeah, that's the mainstream view is that a lot of these things were hoaxes. There's a very famous incident that became a children's book called The Giant Who Wasn't There, where this dude basically fabricated these giant bones at the end of the 19th century and was circulating them around in circus shows and stuff like that. And so the general impression that mainstream Americans got was that, these were all forgeries. But if you look really closely at a lot of the documentation that's out there, people were finding persons of larger than average stature, larger than normal stature, all over the country, especially in the Midwest and in the Great Lakes region. So this is very well documented. When you ask mainstream archaeologists about this, they'll say, "Well, where are the bones now?" And there's a couple of explanations about that. But they'll say, even the photographic evidence, even the newspaper clippings, newspaper documentation, for a lot of mainstream scholars, that's not enough. Still kind of drawing on this late 19th century idea that all this was just a hoax, that this was just a fad, um, and that there's no real merit to this. But there's a tradition for giants going way back to the first European settlers. John Smith, for example, one of my favorite things is early American history. So Jamestown, I actually went there a few weeks back, actually longer than that, about a month ago with my wife and kids down in Virginia. And there was a book that they had with the writings of Captain John Smith, and he has wood carvings in there where he's fighting some Native Americans, and these guys are giant and they're huge. And even some of the other uh, early explorers, early European explorers, are talking about how when they talked to the Indian chieftain, all of the chieftains, all the main people in the tribe were of extraordinary stature, at least 7 or 8 feet. So I say all that. I rant like that to just say that this was a long-standing tradition, and we have evidence, documentation for this, written documentation for it, going way back before you kind of get these hoaxes in the 19th century.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you cleared that up, because honestly, I kind of dismissed the whole thing. And
A
it's
lot of people
interesting.
still do. Yeah.
And I still am a skeptic, of course, but the bones disappearing, it's interesting, because I remember they found tons of human remains in like the island of Malta. They found tons of skeletons. They're all gone. They can't find them anymore.
Yeah.
So the idea that bones would go missing is unfortunately something that's very common within the history of the early days of archaeology. They were sloppy in a lot of things. It may not, because some people think it's a conspiracy. Sometimes it's just they weren't professional. They weren't handling them correctly, and so that could also be part of it too.
Very true. I think both things are going on. So they found these bones in like a bog. So the mounds are like kind of in a bog area. As soon as you take those bones out, they're going to start to deteriorate. And just if you don't do the right thing with them and really take efforts immediately to preserve these bones, they're going to deteriorate pretty bad. I do think that the Smithsonian had somewhat of an agenda, and people call me a conspiracy theorist here, to kind of down at least I'll just say this safely, to at least downplay these findings of these giants and these mounds, because that would kind of suggest that the Native Americans prior to the European conquest had some type of civilization, which in the late 19th century, that's not a view that you want to support if you're trying to get the Native Americans land. So I do think there's stuff going on there. Other people will say, and I've even kind of argued for this in the past, I think I'm more moderate now, that the Smithsonian is going around deliberately destroying, uh, destroying these bones, destroying this evidence. But I definitely think that there's kind of a suppression of this type of history going on. History for Smithsonian doesn't begin till 1492, and it's only recently, in the past couple of decades, that they've started to change that.
Mm. And you also maybe you do talk a little bit about like Manifest Destiny playing a role in that. You
Exactly.
see the Trail of Tears.
Hmm.
You want to kind of detach these people, the Native Americans, from anything that would any structures that would have been, because a structure is a land claim within the Western mind.
Yeah.
If they could detach them from that, then they can detach them from their land and do these kind of things. So talk maybe a little bit about that being an emphasis too.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's funny, Steve, because as an archive librarian, I'm working on a collection for the school I work at, and a lot of the collection consists of letters from Chief John Ross. I don't know if you know who that is, but he was one of the main Cherokee chiefs. He went to my school. He's one of the few Native Americans who went to my school in the 1800s, and he basically he has this conversation, this dialogue with the headmaster of the school, which lasts for about 50 years, and it goes through the Civil War. He goes on the side of the Confederacy, which a lot of Native Americans did, not all, but especially Native Americans in the South joined the Confederacy. And then later on, he was involved with the Trail of Tears. So and his letters are utterly heartbreaking, Steve, because it just documents kind of the treatment, the view that Native Americans basically were animals and had no type of history, no type of culture, no type of civilization at all. And I say this, as an African American, as a Black American, I think a lot of times my own people get the perception that, we're the only ones who've gone through stuff, we're the only ones who've been stereotyped. But this has happened with a lot of people. I mean, you look at the Native American, basically the history of the Native American. This has happened, to other people as well. Human beings have a tendency, unfortunately, to scapegoat certain people, whether they be Jews, Native Americans, Black people, whatever.
Yeah, and that is very true. And there's a lot of politics going on at this time as well. So I wanted to say that this book was it's a quick read. And actually you have a different edition. This is the you actually have
Yes, the
another.
earlier edition, and some of my friends were like, you should, spice it up a bit, um, make it more fancy. So the edition now has a much nicer cover, and it's much better formatted
Oh, okay.
than the earlier edition, but it's the same exact text.
Yep. So, and what was interesting is you actually early on in the book talk about like actually you talk about the idea that there were giants in the Bible.
Hmm.
Uh, and I want to tie that in because I actually have some questions because, well, let's talk about giants in the Bible. So talk about the history of giants in the Bible, the idea that you would have had the Nephilim, these fallen angels, pre-flood, but also post-flood. You
Yep.
had places that were known to have giants within,
Hmm.
and stuff like that. So talk about the how the Bible deals with giants.
Yeah, we get giants right at the beginning of the Bible. So in Genesis 6, like you said, you have the Nephilim, translated from or taken from the Hebrew verb nephal, meaning to fall. And that's commonly in Christian interpretation, even in Jewish interpretation, that's understood as referring to fallen angels. Then in the 20th century, you have people that I actually really like from a pop cultural perspective, Von Daniken, Stitchin, who say that these refer to like alien spaceships that crashed thousands of years ago. But you have these Nephilim who seem to be uh, taller than normal stature, and we know that from kind of the history of interpretation of the Genesis 6 text. So the term Nephilim gets translated into Greek as gigantes, and the same in Latin. So you have these giants who should die out during the flood, but they pop up again. So the Nephilim are kind of seen as synonymous with the Anakim, and the Anakim pop up again in early Israelite history when Moses and the Israelites are going into the Promised Land and trying to go into the Promised Land. They see the sons of Anak, to whom they were like, and I quote from the Hebrew Bible, grasshoppers. So whoever these Anakim are, they're huge people. And so the Israelites just continue to encounter these giants throughout their history. And of course, there's the very famous giant Goliath in the Deuteronomic history and in First Samuel. So Israel encounters these giants, and one of the arguments I make in my book is that, as with many things in the Old Testament involving the Israelites, when they encounter something, there's usually cultural exchange. So even though in the Deuteronomic history, the Israelites are seen as kind of the arch enemies of the Canaanites. We know kind of from archaeology, they are they adopt a lot of cultural features of the Canaanites and intermix with the Canaanites in many ways. And I think one of the arguments I make is that there's this type of intermixing going on between these giants and Israel as well.
Yeah, and then maybe just talk about so you have this history of giants, and you know it's fascinating because like you even hear echoes of it in the New Testament. Um, when you are like with the Enochian tradition,
With
um,
Jude and Colossians and Second Peter, excuse me.
yeah, and
Yeah.
then you also have the Apostle Paul talking about women wearing head coverings to not
hmm
to tempt the angels, and
hmm
implying the kind of a
Going
Nephilim.
right back to Genesis 6. Yep,
Exactly.
where they took the daughters of men. Yes.
Yeah. And so that's also interesting. And yeah, maybe just because not everybody's familiar with the Bible. So why don't we just talk about the origin of the Nephilim? What are they, and also with the daughters of men? Because I think we should probably just go back to that history a little bit too. Maybe describe that.
Yeah, so in Genesis 6, it talks about the Nephilim taking on having sexual relations with the daughters of men, and they produce Ish Gabor, I believe, in the Hebrew, the mighty man. Basically, in the Greek and in the Latin, the heroes of old. And Josephus, he's a famous historian famous Jewish historian that Christians drew on in the early Christian period. He equates the children of the Nephilim and these daughters of men with the gods of Greek mythology. So he equates them directly with Heracles and others. And like as I mentioned before, there's a long-standing tradition that the Nephilim are fallen angels. I just take them in reference to this fallen civilization of giants. So these are people that were human, but of above average height. And they're having sexual relations with normal sized human women and having these offspring. So I don't necessarily take the Nephilim as being a supernatural group. I do think they come from a civilization which, even for the time of the author of Genesis 6, the Yahwist, I believe, was unknown to him. It was so old that the memory of it had been lost to the biblical authors.
Hmm. And then now it's you wanted to, one of the things that you try to do with your book is you're trying to show that there's like an Egyptian. Brings a lot of people think like the way Egypt is portrayed in the Bible is that it's the bad
Mhm.
guys, bad,
Yeah,
but there's actually a
same with
history.
Canaanites.
History kind of shows that actually Egypt and had a much more profound influence on Israel than
hmm
people realize, but also wasn't always the bad place for Jews to go to. It was also a place that was also a safe space. Ironically enough, it was a place that they
Yep.
fled to when there was destruction in Israel. They built a temple like Solomon, and
hmm
they had the flourishing
Yep.
Jewish civilization in Egypt. So maybe talk about the Egyptian Jewish connection as well, because you tie that all in beautifully in this book.
Yeah. So you have the giants intermarrying with the Israelites, producing above average people in height. And then you have the Israelites intermingling with the Egyptians. I mean, you get this from again from kind of the beginning of the Bible in Exodus with Moses intermingling with Egyptians, and then later on in Jeremiah, you have Israelites fleeing to Egypt, like you said, to escape the destruction of Jerusalem. And Jeremiah is very upset about this. He hates that you know Israelites are going down to Egypt, but it's something that they're doing, as evidenced from his writings. And the king of the southern kingdom, Zedekiah, has actually an alliance with the king of Egypt, which is why his people are able to flee there. But that alliance is not enough against King Nebuchadnezzar. But like you said, the Israelites basically who go down there, especially in the destruction of in 586 BCE, after that period, the post-exilic period, they stayed there. They found a temple at Elephantine. We have their letters written in Aramaic. And ultimately, what comes from that is the emergence of a Jewish community in Alexandria, from which we get the Greek Bible directly. So there is a lot of cultural exchange between the Israelites, what later become the Jews, and Egypt. And I kind of tie this into the Book of Mormon because Nephi is talking about the reformed Egyptian. And I say that this Egyptian giant hybrid, these are the type of people, the Nephites, who come over to the New World and are the creators of these mounds that we see in North America.
Okay, so I'm glad you brought up Nephi because this is the thing. It's always been staring me in the face directly. You don't actually address this in the book, but Nephi and Nephilim are basically very similar. They're spelled
Hmm.
very similarly. And then Nephi is described as being large in stature.
Large in
There's,
stature. Yep.
yep. So to me, is there a connection with Nephi and the Nephilim? Is it
I
possible that?
hadn't thought about the etymological connection, but that's very possible. They would be spelled the same way.
Mhm.
The Nephilim, Nun, Pe, Lamed, Yod, Mem, and then for Nephi, Nun, Pe, Yod. But consonantally, they'd be very similar.
Mhm.
So I'm wondering, and a lot of times with Israelite names, they'll name children based on ancestors from long ago. So that's definitely something that's possible. I should make a revised edition where I talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, because I've actually I've had conversations with people about that actually there being a like a Nephilim connection to Nephi, and so
That's
I
very possible. And a lot of times with Israelite names, they'll get what's the word I'm looking for? Reduced. So you'll have we see this all the time. So I'm trying to think of a good Israelite name where this is the example. So for a lot of the prophets, Jeremiah, Yirmayahu, that Yahu at the end is the name of God, but it's shortened. So instead of Yod He Vav He, it's just Yod He Vav. So you could argue that something similar is happening here with the name Nephi. It's just it's shortened. So instead of Nephilim, the full version, you just get Nephi.
okay. Well, I think that's fascinating to have this conversation with you. That's great. And then so because you basically say that basically you make the argument that in the Midwest in particular, we
Mm-hmm.
have found Hebrew relics, we have found Egyptian-like relics, we have found and we have found giants.
Yes.
And you also say that there's similarities in some of the structural patterns with the mounds that you find with the Egyptian
Mm-hmm.
pyramids. Maybe talk a lot about all those connections that you're making in the book.
Yeah. Monk's Mound in Ohio has the same dimensions, the exact same dimensions as the Great Pyramid of Giza. And the mounds today, if you visit them, one of the things I enjoy doing, one of my favorite things, Steve, is throwing the kids in the car and driving to visit various mounds. So we've been all up and down the East Coast uh, visiting whatever mounds may be in certain states. So we've been to mounds in Virginia. We've been to mounds in West Virginia. We've been to mounds even in Delaware. We've been to mounds in Pennsylvania. And then when I go out west to Ohio and stuff, I've been to the Newark Earthworks, Fort Ancient, all of those mounds. I've not been to Cahokia yet, but I hope to do that in the future. But my whole point of this rant is that when you look at the mounds now, they just seem like humps of grass, just clumps of grass, clumps of dirt. Back in the day, they would have been highly decorated. So they would have looked exactly like a pyramid that you would have gotten in Egypt and a pyramid that you would have gotten kind of in South America. So they were decorated. They were decorated lavishly. These were kind of the spiritual centers of their of the community.
And so then what you do is you like to try to use the idea that we have this record of this civilization written in Reformed Egyptian,
Hmm.
and you're trying to tie that in with this as well. But you're also then tying in the idea that we have these groups. Now, there are anthropologists that will push back on this, but for the purpose of this conversation, you tie in these what are called the Adena and Hopewell
Hmm.
civilizations. You kind of identify them as the potential
Nephites and
peoples
Lamanites.
and the
Yeah.
Nephites and Lamanites. Oh,
Yeah.
well, or Jaredites and Nephites and Lamanites too.
Yeah.
So maybe
Yeah.
talk a little bit about the Adena Hopewell thing as well.
Yeah, so the Adena and Hopewell, those aren't their actual names. We don't know what these people were called. Hopewell and Adena come from the people who, in the 19th century, owned the sites on which the mounds were found. So we don't know the names of these people, but they seem to have had cultural similarities as well as cultural differences. So, for example, the Adena often made their mounds were often burial mounds. So that's where we find a lot of the giants. Whereas the Hopewell, a lot of their mounds were for mainly for ceremonial purposes. Now there is some back and forth with this. There is some overlay with this, but they seem to be two related cultures, though they have, like I said, some culturally some distinct things between them as well. But they, during the Woodland period, the early Mississippi period, they seem to have been the kings, the rulers of the Great Lakes area and the Midwest region, Ohio, what's now Ohio, West Virginia, Illinois, etc. So they were basically the definitive culture in the area at that time, and they intermingle with the Native Americans. They intermarry with Native Americans, and so Native American descendants. It's my contention. A lot of Heartlanders would say this as well. Are descended from these this Hopewell and Adena group. But the Hopewell and Adena seem to have, and this is where the debate gets really, really big, Steve. They seem to have Semitic features. So there are inscriptions that people have found in the mounds, and for mainstream archaeologists, and I think for the mainstream public in general, they would say a lot of these are hoaxes, a lot of these are forgeries, but that's not the case for every single one. And there are a lot of these inscriptions that have been found in mounds in areas that weren't forgeries or deliberately buried. They seem to have been there with the actual objects that were originally in the mound.
Some
So
of the
we do get forgeries. So for the Michigan relics, for example, which I argue for a lot of their authenticity, there was a dude, Schofield, who found relics, but was also forging them. He forged a ton of them. You can tell the ones that he forged, but because of that, people discredited the Michigan relics in general, even though relics were found by other people besides Schofield in other parts of Michigan and Detroit more specifically.
Okay, yeah, and I'm highly skeptical of the Michigan relics,
Yeah,
but
a lot of people, that's kind of the mainstream view.
yeah,
So, yeah,
but you're saying there might be some that are authentic.
I believe there's some who there are authentic. Yes.
Can you give me an example of like the best Michigan relic that you would say is authentic?
There is and I have a picture of it on my wall, but it's over here. There is a Michigan relic depicting three heads and what looks like an ark vessel,
Okay.
and very detailed craftsmanship. Like I said, you can tell the one Schofield forged because they're made from really crappy material. They break apart easily, and you can tell it's just his drawing. This one is much more detailed. And with my friend David Lindsley has talked about this some more. There's some Michigan relics that seem to have been made by three different craftsmen at the same time. So they display evidence of being made by more than just one person, of being composed by more than just one person, which kind of rules out that Schofield himself uh, just forged all of these, created all of these on his own. So that's some of the evidence in favor of the Michigan relics.
And then
For
a
other
few,
evidence, read my book. Yes.
yeah, well, and then of course there's a few other ones that I've been familiar with for a long time. They're pretty well known as the Bat Creek Stone and the Ohio Decalogue Stone. Maybe describe those a little bit.
Yeah, so the Bat Creek Stone has a phrase, Kadosh Adonai, holiness to the Lord, written in Paleo Hebrew. That's always been evidence for me that we're looking at something authentic, because if somebody wanted to forge something in the late 19th century, he would just write it in the script that's now used for Hebrew, Aramaic script, which is a script, if you open up a Tanakh or a Hebrew Bible, that's the script that it's written in, but this is written in Paleo Hebrew script. Same as with the Los Lunas stone in New Mexico, that's also written in Paleo Hebrew. And there's a very famous biblical scholar, one of the greats, Cyrus Gordon, who actually, he got into a lot of trouble with this. It kind of hurt his reputation. He argued for the authenticity of the Bat Creek stone. The Newark Decalogue stone is another relic that we have, which gives kind of a paraphrase, like the Los Lunas Decalogue stone, gives kind of a paraphrase of the Ten Commandments. But that's written in Aramaic script, and clearly, if it's authentic, would be after 585 BCE.
Okay, good. Thanks for describing that. And then
But I should add, so the Newark Decalogue stone is part of what we refer to as a corpus of items called the Newark Holy Stones. And a lot of basically mainstream archaeology dismisses them as a hoax, as a forgery, but they were found in the same level as other artifacts, which mainstream archaeologists do not dismiss as forgeries.
Okay, well, I'm glad. I'm
The
glad.
main reason that they do that is because the Newark Holy Stones have Hebrew inscriptions on them, which basically mainstream scholars conclude that somebody must have placed these here to kind of support a view that Israelites came to America.
So let's just talk a little bit about the idea of diffusionism. With people like Barry Fell, you also
Mm-hmm.
reference Menzies, who wrote the China 1421 book, that
Yep.
the Chinese may have come here before Columbus, and that there have been other civilizations that may have been cross-pollinating. You can talk about Sorensen talks about that.
Mm-hmm.
That there's a type of diffusionism. Even Michael Coe goes so far as to say that he thinks there might be a Chinese diffusionism going on with
Mm-hmm.
Central America as well. So even a mainstream guy like Michael Coe, who's very critical of the
Yep.
Book of Mormon, is
Yeah.
open to the idea that there could be also diffusion going on too.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe just talk about diffusionism a little bit for the audience.
Yeah, so there are kind of two main views about ancient America. One's the migration view, one's a diffusionist view. So the migration view is basically a Clovis model. People come from Asia into through the Bering Strait into North America, and that's that. So the culture of the Native Americans really comes from kind of these Asian people who migrated into the area. Then you have diffusionism, which is not necessarily dismiss Clovis, but says that other groups came and influenced Native American culture and had, or at least had interaction with Native American culture as well. We know this probably the biggest, best example of this is with the Vikings. So we know that they came over and settled here. But there are other groups that seem to have done this as well. So, for example, there's an academic textbook that for many years was kind of the staple of North American archaeology called Ancient North America. And in the back, in the index of that book, they have some examples of Phoenician diffusionism, where they found items from the Phoenicians that appear in North America. So mainstream archaeology is willing to give some way to some examples of diffusionism. They just don't believe that there was, with the exception of Cyrus Gordon, they don't believe that there was diffusionism when in regards to Israelite or Jewish culture influencing North America.
And it's interesting because Rick Bennett is out in for the Community of Christ conference this week, and he went to
Yes,
Iowa, where the Heartlanders have built that the museum for the Phoenicia.
yes. The Phoenicia. I actually work out there every summer. I'll drive out to John Lefgren invites me out there, and I spend like a week basically working on the ship. And so, yeah, we spent last summer, we spent a whole week just trying to burn off pieces that had basically caked onto the ship. And so he's still in the process of putting that together. And that's kind of an example of of diffusion with the Phoenicians coming over to North America.
And what I want to explain, folks, is this was a expedition where they rebuilt a Phoenician style boat,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yep.
it would have been around the Book of Mormon times. And they took it around the Horn of Africa, and they were trying to basically circumnavigate Africa and find their way back to the Mediterranean. But the currents kept on taking them towards the New World.
Mm-hmm.
And so the thought is, and I know Boyd Tuttle was on that expedition,
Yes.
and so now this boat was in Miami for a while, but they were able to get this boat, and they're building this museum because they're using this as evidence that one, the Heartlanders believe that that most likely the Nephites landed around the Panhandle of Florida and migrated
And
north.
migrate up, which
Yep.
would explain the mounds that you have in Mississippi and Alabama. There's a ton of mounds there as well. So it's basically, you can try and track their trajectory. They're making their way up the Mississippi River all the way to the Midwest and up into the Great Lakes.
Yeah. So it says Montrose, Iowa. Is that where the is, or
Yes. Fort Madison, Ohio. I
Fort
mean, Fort
Madison?
Madison, Iowa. Excuse me.
Fort Madison, Iowa. Oh, so yeah, I'd hopefully like to check that out. It's a pretty interesting theory, but it does seem to show that the currents could take a Phoenician ship that way, and towards the New
Yeah.
World. So I'm not totally unconvinced that, yeah, I think there's a possibility that there might have been more going on than what we realize. And of course, we know the Vikings are an example of that as well. So you are, of course, a believer in the Book of Mormon, and so you feel like the Book of Mormon actually helps with this view. I just have a question interestingly enough, I know that there's also a theory that the Jaredites might also be giants.
Yes. So some people, and there's a little bit of debate within the Heartlander model as to whether the Adena should be recognized as the Jaredites or if it's the Nephites and the Lamanites. So there's some debate about that. I have very good friends who say, no, if you're talking about the Adena, you're talking about the Jaredites. If you're talking about the Hopewell, you're talking about what becomes kind of the Nephites and the Lamanites. So they group the Nephites and Lamanites with the Hopewell rather than the Adena.
Right. And then it's interesting because in Don Bradley's book, The Lost 116 Pages, he implies that in the Lost 116 Pages that it may be hinted at that they actually, when they landed, they came across these ruins, Lehi's company, and they saw these ruins and they thought they were built by giants. Apparently that so even within the original, in the book of Lehi, apparently giants do make their appearance in there, which I find interesting, because I always thought, why didn't Joseph ever talk about the Nephilim? Why didn't he ever really talk about giants? I always thought that, but apparently in the original manuscript, giants may have been referred to as well.
Yeah, and Joseph Smith, one of the things that kind of drew me to the Heartland model is Joseph Smith makes reference, there's Zelph, of course,
That's self. Yep.
And there's these mummies that he finds in Kentucky, which also has mounds. One of the Adena mounds I went to, right near the place I got baptized. I was telling you that story last time we were together. There was an Adena mound literally right down the street from where I got baptized, and that was in Kentucky. That was in Lexington, Kentucky, and Joseph Smith talks about mummies that he found in Lexington, Kentucky, that he identifies with the Nephite people.
I never heard that story before.
Yeah.
Really?
In the teachings of Joseph Smith.
Interesting.
That book. Yep.
And then, of course, we have the story of Zelph, which he said was a giant. They found a giant skeleton, and he identified Zelph as a white Lamanite, and so and then of course he's roaming along the plains of the Nephites as he described it in his letter to Emma. So it seems to me that Joseph was a Heartlander as well.
Yeah. I don't think, and I my Mesoamerican friends would disagree with me, but I think if you take the testimony of Joseph and even Albert Cottery, John Neville talks about this a lot. If you take just their testimony, they definitely are setting the Book of Mormon in North America rather than South America. I don't even think South America's on their radar.
What is so fascinating to me is that the Church of Christ with Elijah message, the assured way of the Lord, officially is a Heartlander church as well.
Yes.
So the Heartlanders, that's interesting. There's actually a church within the Restoration that considers the Book of Mormon geography to have taken place in the Midwest of the United States, which is really interesting.
It's funny, Steve, that now that you mentioned it, I think we might be the only ones who officially do that. Because I know that the Restoration branches, they have the Mesoamerican view. In fact, I got their magazine today, The Witness. I've been getting it for years, and they had some lidar from Mesoamerica that they were talking about. So I don't think any other restoration tradition officially takes the Heartland view, but we do.
Yeah, and you're one of the few that actually takes an official position, period.
Yeah.
A lot of them, it's not a matter of like it's an official position. A lot of it's speculative in a lot of these groups as well. Man, I'll tell you, I find this interesting. Was there anything else you wanted to tell us about giants?
I could go on all day about giants. So I love giants. But yeah, one of the things. So, and I've said this to other people before. When I encountered the Book of Mormon, I knew nothing about the Book of Mormon. But I had this mystical encounter with it, and I knew it was the Word of God. And so, kind of in doing research, kind of from a Heartlander perspective, using the Heartlander model, doing research has been something that's very much added on to my faith. And it's in my own writings, it's something that I argue for others who are interested in where the Book of Mormon might have happened, because I think that one of the dilemmas that people who believe in the Book of Mormon have is that they often get pushed back that there's no historical evidence for the Book of Mormon. So for me, the mounds and the giants are that historical evidence that the Book of Mormon took place.
So another thing I wanted to talk to you about briefly was you're also fascinated by the Book of Abraham, and even though your church doesn't have it in their canon,
Yeah.
and maybe just talk about your fascination about the Book of Abraham and the message of the Book of Abraham.
Yeah, I absolutely love the Book of Abraham. So I'm speaking as Adam Stokes, just Adam Stokes, not speaking as an apostle. It's not accepted by my church. My first experience, so I'll tell you how I became interested in the Book of Abraham. If you don't mind, I'm going to grab a book.
Oh yeah, please do.
Um,
Yeah, yeah. Well, while he's doing that, folks, I just wanted to show that Adam has written for BYU Studies. He's also written this book called The Latin Scrolls, selections from the five megalith translated from the Latin Vulgate, written and edited by Adam Stokes, MDiv. So he's also a published scholar as well. Okay, I was just telling my audience a little bit about your academic background a little
Oh
bit.
yeah, I've loved writing all those books. Interestingly, From Egypt to Ohio was written under extreme duress. I was teaching at a public school in Trenton at the time, and it was a god awful place. So kind of my escape whenever I got some free time with my lunch or something, I would work on that book. Thankfully, when I write now, it's in much better conditions. So Steve, you are absolutely privileged to view the first Book of Mormon I ever had. This is going to tie into exactly your question of why the Book of Abraham. So this is my triple combination that I got. So after the Hotel Marriott, like I said, I didn't take the Book of Mormon out of the Hotel Marriott, but I did go to a used bookstore. And the very first Book of Mormon I found was this triple combination with the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, and Pearl of Great Price.
Okay.
And it's from that I started. I read through the Book of Mormon. I skipped the Doctrine and Covenants for some reason. It seemed at the time kind of boring to me. I love the Doctrine. I love the Book of Commandments and the Doctrine and Covenants, but I went straight to the Pearl of Great Price and I started reading the Book of Abraham, and I was just blown away by it. I think because it has the claim, which I believe in, that it's an ancient Egyptian text. But there was also some really cool stuff in the Book of Abraham. So God, I'm a sci-fi geek. So God, different planets that God's created, different worlds that God's created, inhabitants on those worlds, God having a planet himself, Kolob, and the whole gods thing, which I kind of like from kind of my Greco-Roman interest. I've always taken the God. So here's the thing. One of the reasons that my church doesn't accept the Book of Abraham, and the Community of Christ as well, is the idea of multiple gods. So I mentioned before, my church is modalist. So Jesus, God the Father, and the Holy Spirit are one and the same. And the Community of Christ, for example, and other restoration branches, they would argue, the Book of Mormon, the Book of Abraham teaches polytheism. I've never had a problem with the reference to multiple gods. One, because I guess because of my background as a Latin teacher, as a classicist. But two, you have in the Bible itself this notion of a divine court. So gods to me just refer to like divine beings. They could be angels or whatever. So that never tripped me up very much. I think looking back on it now, one of the things I love, kind of the message of the Book of Abraham, is God coming in at the last minute and delivering Abraham. So Abraham's being persecuted, and God just doesn't abandon him, but God comes and basically frees Abraham and rescues him from his enemies. And I think that was something with all the stuff that I was going through. That was the kind of God that I was looking for, and the kind of God that I couldn't find in my 20s. I was telling you some about that last time we talked. But a God that personally cares for Abraham, a God who personally encounters Abraham. And that's kind of my own experience with the restoration. So not trying to say that I'm Abraham, but I definitely see my own kind of spiritual journey, my own kind of spiritual experience in Abraham's experience in the Book of Abraham. And like I said, I just find the kind of Egyptian connection that the Book of Abraham has very, very fascinating. And kind of comparing it to other Latter-day Saint literature, kind of the way Abraham's portrayed, for example, in the Joseph Smith translation, and even comparing it to, extra biblical sources, the Apocalypse of Abraham, Abraham in the Septuagint. I just find all of that really fascinating. And all that kind of comes out if you read the review of John Gee's book, John Gee's excellent work that he did on the Book of Abraham. If you read my review of that, all of that interest kind of comes out.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
my own personal canon is much bigger than the official canon of my church.
And your church uses the Joseph Smith translation?
No, we only use the King James.
I'll just use the King James. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. But you personally enjoy the Joseph Smith translation. You like
I
you like,
absolutely love the Joseph Smith translation. So
and
yeah, that was the book that got me into the restoration to begin with.
fascinating. What a great story. What an interesting story of your life that you've been able to come on our show previously to talk about. I wasn't sure about this whole giants thing. I still am not, but
That's
I
fine.
thought it was kind of a fun read. And I also thought like you did do some scholarship here talking about biblical scholarship. I think it's actually kind of a cool book because it's really easy to read, but it also makes modern biblical scholarship accessible and maybe explains some of the issues about, that too. So I thought you did a good job explaining to lay people maybe the lay of the land in that
So what
regard
happens
too.
when you have a failed PhD? You did all the coursework, so you know about biblical studies, but you just never got the PhD.
Yeah, yeah. So, hey, Adam, was there anything else you wanted to share with our audience today?
I think we talked about quite a bit, so I think
Yeah.
I was able to convey my love for the Book of Mormon, my love for giants, my love for ancient North America. I write every couple of months for Wayne May, an Ancient American magazine. He
Okay.
has another book, that magazine that just came out, Land of Promise. I have an article in there,
Oh,
and I love writing about this stuff. My absolute favorite thing to do, besides translating boring Latin text, is to write about the Book of Mormon and from kind of a Heartlander perspective, from a North American perspective. So this is something that I'm very passionate about, and something that I enjoy immensely.
well, it's great to talk to an African American Mormon apologist, a real one.
A real one, not a fake one. Yes.
Well, Adam, I just want to thank you so much for coming on the program today. And by the way, I got such a great response from my first time interviewing Adam. So if you haven't watched that, please check it out. He's got a great story, and I think you're just a wonderful person who just does a great job telling why you ended up where you ended up at, and then also just have a fascinating interest in all these extracurricular topics and that kind of fun stuff. And I really appreciate somebody who gets joy out of studying giants. That's awesome. I love that stuff, dude. So thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate you, dude.
Thanks for having me. This is awesome as always.
So I just want to remind you, all of you, that there'll be links in the description to Adam's book and whatever, and also I want to make sure you send me a link to your church as well, so people can also
Will
check
do.
out your church's website. Also, there's links for those of you who'd like to financially support the channel on both PayPal as well as Patreon. I want to thank those of you who are financially supporting the channel. Just a reminder, MormonBookReviews.com, merch store, hats, mugs, t-shirts. Folks, we haven't really sold a whole lot lately, and I just want you guys go check out the website. Anthony put
I've
a
got to
lot of
get the coffee cup. My wife would love the coffee cup.
okay, or hot chocolate mugs, either way, whether
Yes.
your word of wisdom or not.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Yes.
And so folks, just check out our merch store. We have a lot of great stuff there. It's mormonbookreviews.com. We'd like to get more people to purchase our merch, and of course, people to financially support the channel. But remember, this is the most important thing, folks, is this: all the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.